Hello and welcome to Fight News Now. I'm John Pollock. Coming up over the next hour, we're going to be chatting with Robin Black and John Ramdeen about a whole slew of news. Bellator and Quinton Jackson have come to a resolution. The UFC has made a number of re-signings. We'll also be discussing all of the catastrophe attached to the Pittsburgh card this Sunday, with many fights falling apart and some new fighters added to the card. Also coming up, we'll take a look back at Raw from Monday night with myself and Wei Ting, as well as a look at the next Glory event happening in Chicago. Buckle up, it's time for Fight News Now. I am here with John Ramdeen and Robin Black. It's a busy news day. We're going to dive into it immediately. And this one, just breaking right as we are about to start chatting, involving Quinton Rampage Jackson and Bellator apparently coming to an amicable agreement, and Quinton Jackson will resume his career in a Bellator cage. So hopefully you can keep your Fight Pass subscription and remember that UFC 186 dream, because that's all it will be. And it doesn't look like Quinton is going back to the UFC anytime soon. And I go back to when Quinton first signed with Bellator. I think this is a better fit for the guy. I think long-term, he's got more options in Bellator, fighting at light heavyweight, or even eventually at heavyweight if he so chooses. And with Bellator, it just feels like a better fit for Quinton Jackson at this stage of his career.
Yeah, I have to agree 100%. And you have the Bellator organization has the luxury of attaching themselves to a veteran like Quinton Jackson, and when they're trying to develop their 205-pound division, we were talking about it, you know, to put Rampage and Phil Davis up against each other, or to put Rampage and Tito Ortiz. There are so many options.
Dada 5,000.
Yeah, sure. If you want to do that, if you want to have Fedor versus Quinton Jackson and
this
Ryzen,
opens the door for that.
Exactly. So there's a lot of
weird way.
It does. It's very true. It's something that we've seen. Scott Coker is not necessarily a guy that sticks with the norm. He decides to color outside of the boxes, and I think Quinton Jackson can add to that model.
Now, Scott Coker's a smart dude. Like, you know, that is pretty obvious. And you're looking at the whole scenario. I think, pretty sure it was a business expert who's a fight fan, I think it was at Forbes.com, who wrote a pretty cool article about if you got two big companies with a similar budget, but one of them has a lot of the talent. It doesn't matter if they're computer companies or lawn care companies or whatever, you're going to get some. So far right now, Bellator appears to be going, we can't, you know, if we get one extra guy at 145, or if we get one heavyweight prospect, no. They're looking at 155 and 205 that have kind of traditionally been the marquee divisions. You got Tito and you got everyone
Randy
you mentioned at
Chuck,
205.
yeah.
All of a sudden, you got Ben Henderson that you're adding at 55 to go along with Michael Chandler and all your 155. You can't build them all simultaneously, but what if you can build two great divisions? It seems to be a good plan.
It's almost been unanimous, you know, amongst fighters I've spoken to with Bellator, that they all kind of subscribe to the Scott Coker method. They have faith in this guy, which isn't always the case with promoters. Quinton Jackson was brought under Bjorn Rebney, and in fairness to Jackson, he was brought in with a completely different business plan where pay-per-view was going to be a big thing for the company, and Quinton Jackson would share in the successes of those pay-per-views. So when Scott Coker comes in, pay-per-views are gone. We are a television product. So this very much restructured what Quinton Jackson, what his deal was with Bellator. So I think it's interesting as we look at when Coker came in, he had a lot of goodwill when he pretty much allowed Eddie Alvarez. He didn't want to be here. We're going to let him go. Quinton Jackson, he had voiced his decision. He wanted to go to the UFC. That was when Coker put his foot down and said, no, that guy we want here.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And I'm sure when the dust settled and Scott Coker had a chance to sit down with Quinton and his team and they figured things out, and you know, Coker, I'm sure, put Quinton and his people in contact with all the people that, because if you hear it in the industry, many fighters, very few of them have any negatives to say about Scott Coker. They say he's a straight shooter. The goal is
very
to help,
personable amongst fighters.
Exactly, and the goal is to build their specific brand of mixed martial arts. And Coker would tell a guy like Michael Chandler, after re-signing with the Bellator organization, we want to make you the face of the Bellator organization. How do we need to do that? He's very, as you mentioned, very personable with these guys. And I think that's one of the the selling points for fighters is to have somebody that they respect working with.
While we're looking at it, you got Rampage Jackson, who is, in the later stages of his career. A name, he's got a lot of value. And then you have Ben Henderson, who's a killer fighter. But when Ben was getting ready to go, when the UFC's kind of looking at it and going, we can't necessarily keep absolutely everybody. Ben Henderson was a champion who's down around 8 or 9. That's the wrong direction. You go ahead and you sign Aljamain Sterling. There's a guy who was 20 to 10 on his way up. That's who the UFC wants to sign. In theory, that's how you look at having a future. And when you ask Aljamain Sterling what the difference was, when he tells his friends he's in Bellator, they don't know what he's talking about. And that alone, to a young fighter with a future, hey man, I'm the Bellator champion, doesn't mean anything to your grandmother. It doesn't mean anything to your neighbor. It doesn't mean anything to the guy at the bar who lets you in. The guy at the front door who's standing out front going, who are you? That guy's a UFC fighter. Come on in. That guy's a Bellator fighter. What the hell's that?
Yeah, it's true, because we talked when we were in Michigan, we talked to Uriah Faber, and he said for years, that's what I had to explain to people. Most people in the industry recognized me as one of the top fighters on the planet, but people had no idea what Gladiator Challenge was, or WEC. Cage Warriors, or the WEC. He said it was only when I made that move to the UFC that people started to see me as the top guy.
They literally would say to him, oh, is that like the UFC?
Yes.
That's like the UFC. And that alone, that's got value to an Aljamain Sterling, and he's got value to the UFC.
Did it surprise you at all that Aljamain Sterling, maybe not so much that he chose the UFC, but that the UFC took their original offer, which Sterling really wasn't all that impressed with, and they decided to up the ante? Because Aljamain Sterling, let's be honest, as a commodity, as someone that you can put on television, he's relatively unknown at this stage. That may be very different a year, 18 months from now, but at the present, I don't think that Bellator looks at him as someone that's going to come in and immediately bring a big audience. But the UFC, I think they very much see this guy at bantamweight as someone that, hey, he's got some personality. He's a tremendous fighter. Owns a win over Takam Mizugaki. We want to keep this person.
Yeah, I think for the UFC, they don't want to lose their future to the Bellator organization. They know that any of the free agents, we're going to be talking with the competition, whether that's Bellator, that's One Championship, or whoever it is. For Aljamain Sterling, you've got a guy that you can bank on. You can sell this guy. He trains with some of the best fighters in the world, including the former middleweight champion in Chris Weidman. I think for Bellator, they don't care. If this guy's a talent, they'll be able to build him. And that whole idea of, if you've never faced off with the current UFC champion, we can just make the claim that we have the best bantamweight in the world, because he's never faced TJ Dillashaw and he's never faced Dominic Cruz, just like when they had Ben Askren. It's like, well, Ben Askren says he's the best 170-pound fighter in the world. Well, George St. Pierre says he's the best 170-pound fighter in the world. Well, who's the best? It's irrelevant, because they're not going to fight. So you can just keep teasing that, just like they could with Aljamain Sterling.
In the end, from a fan perspective, that's how we're kind of trying to look at it. Is the UFC has the most fights for you. They have the most big fights. They have the most top 10 guys. They have the name. They have the audience. They have all that stuff.
You can make the most money in there if you become the UFC champion.
And the interesting part is, in theory, an Aljamain Sterling can make more money and more money and more money all the way up to the top. Ben Henderson was like, well, I think I've made the most money I'm going to make as a champion, and they have the control over whether or not I'm going to get a chance to fight for a champion anymore. Maybe this is better for me. It's kind of feeling like everybody's fitting in where they fit in.
Alistair Overeem is our final name when it comes to re-signings by the UFC, announcing it himself on Monday that he's not only re-signed with the company, but he's going to be fighting on the Netherlands show coming up in May, which is interesting in terms of what heavyweight he's going to drive. If we're under the assumption that Fabricio Verdum and Stipe Miocic is going to be happening just a few days after that fight, it leaves it, and this will segue well into our next one, Roy Nelson, Derrick Lewis, they're accounted for. So that leaves your options of a Cain Velasquez or a Josh Barnett. There are a few options there, but Alistair Overeem staying in UFC, he was one that you have to imagine Bellator would have been aggressive over.
Yeah, you would expect that, and Overeem will be the first guy to say that I actually wasn't really considering any other option but the UFC. The goal was to fight with the best fighters in the world, to stay at the highest level, and everybody...
I'm sure he made out very well on this free agent.
No doubt, I'm sure he did. But what he's saying is the fact that he knew the UFC would re-sign him, just based on his looks, based on his accolades, based on his fighting style. he, I'm sure, knew that the UFC would make a serious push to keep him.
Yeah, and Josh Barnett versus
awesome.
Yeah, come on. That's amazing. That is fantastic. One extra thing kind of tangled up in all of this, isn't there somebody trying, or groups of people trying to sue the UFC saying they're a monopoly?
Yeah.
It's very hard to make that argument right now. You know, when you've got another company being able to go and re-sign people.
Big names, too.
Big names. It's much harder to make that argument today than it was a year ago.
And let's not forget what Aljamain Sterling said on the MMA Hour, that when it came to a competitive outside offer, he was citing World Series of Fighting making a very big offer.
And ONE FC's made offers to guys. Road FC made an offer to Ben Henderson. There's a real competition out there.
All right, UFC 197 is coming up in April. That is the card that will be headlined by Daniel Cormier and John Jones in their rematch for the light heavyweight title. Will also feature the return of BJ Penn. And now that card is shaping up. In the heavyweight division, Roy Nelson will be taking on Derrick Lewis, as we mentioned. That accounts for 2 more heavyweights in this division, as everyone is essentially finding dance partners over the next couple of months. A fun heavyweight fight, and for Derrick Lewis, this is somebody that I think is certainly going to be tested by Roy Nelson, who I thought he fought a very smart fight against Jared Rosholt and very much needed that win.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that you're going to see the same type of thing in this fight with Lewis. Roy Nelson's going to show his fight smarts. He's going to take his time. There's no need to go after this guy aggressively, wait for Derrick Lewis to get tired. He has the mentality of let's try to get our opponents out there as quickly as humanly possible, and I think Roy Nelson will be able to see through that.
There's been a little bit of a specialization on punching you when you're lying on the ground and he's standing above you. And I put it that simply because I think he looks at it that simply. And I think the way you approach heavyweight fights is simple. If I got you on your back and I'm standing above you, I hit you. If you're standing at this distance, it's a simpler game. It's a much simpler game, much simpler to watch, much simpler to enjoy. Everybody loves seeing heavyweights fight.
And that card also gets a featherweight bout in the form of Andre Fili taking on Yair Rodriguez, who we saw on Tough Latin America, and I think ridiculously already being compared to Anthony Pettis as we're throwing out comparables. But nonetheless, this is someone that a very talented, fun striker to watch, and Andre Fili, of course, part of Team Alpha Male, which will probably generate a million questions thrown his way about this camp, which I think is the biggest distraction amongst any camp right now in the sport.
Yeah, I mean, but it's... You're staying relevant. People are talking about you. How many people are really constantly talking about Andre Fili? But because there's the questions surrounding Team Alpha Male and Uriah Faber and TJ Dillashaw and and Joseph Benavidez going to Colorado, many people will question it. Same with Cody Garbrandt.
These guys are getting screwed here. Like, they basically are providing a reality show for people in the fight game, but not getting paid to be on a reality show. Do you know what I mean? If you're gonna have everybody looking into your life, gossiping about your relationships and stuff, go make a reality show and get paid. These guys are getting screwed.
All right, 5 Rounds airs every Monday night here on Fight Network. Tune in at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. It's Robin Black and John Randine with you for a half hour chatting all the news in mixed martial arts.